talk about the doctrine of creation, because there's an interesting point in the book where you say, far from hindering the progress of science, the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation actually spurred it on. Can you explain how that's so?
Yes, that has been one of the most interesting things for me. I got to know John Hedley Brooke in Oxford, who was the first professor of science and religion, and he was a consummate historian, a brilliant historian of science, and he taught me that one of the most important approaches to this whole debate is from the historical perspective. That sets things in order. And one of the most interesting questions posed by historians of science is they noticed, it's very easy to see, that the pioneers, let's think of Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, Babbage, Faraday, all of these people, Boyle, were believers in God. And they represent the peak of the explosion of what we would call modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries. And so they naturally asked the question, is there any relation between the two? And some of the greatest thinkers, particularly Sir Alfred North Whitehead, came to the conclusion, yes, there's a deep connection. It's to do with the medieval belief in God, as Whitehead said. And Lewis, C.S. Lewis, whom I'm old enough to remember actually lecturing, he made a very powerful point, I think, summing up Whitehead's work. He said, men became scientific. Sadly, there were no women scientists in those days. We've redressed that balance. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, there's a deep connection, and I often put it provocatively that I am not remotely ashamed of being both a scientist of sorts and a believer in God, because arguably it was the Judeo-Christian tradition that gave me my subject. And Nobel Prize winners like Melvin Calvin, he said, you know, what is the origin of this conviction that there's order in the universe? He said, I find it in the Hebrew tradition going back thousands of years. And that is the basis for the rise of modern science. And it's not only that, because it's arguable from the biblical perspective that it teaches that the universe is contingent. That is, it could have been otherwise. And so if you want to find out what it's like, you go and look. Now, one of the biggest moves in the history of science came when Kepler abandoned the thinking that had dominated European science for millennia, actually, of Aristotle, which was you start with philosophical principles, you apply them to the universe. In other words, you have a concept of perfection. Perfect motion is circular. So you've got to discover that the perfect motions of the perfect planets and stars beyond the moon must be circular. You try circles, they don't work. Then you put circles upon circles upon circles, epicycles and so on. And Kepler, in an utterly revolutionary step, said, why don't we just go and look and see what it's like? And he very soon came to the conclusion that the planets move in ellipses, equally perfect with sun as focus. And it's that idea which is thoroughly biblical, together with the doctrine of creation. And where the doctrine of creation comes in, of course, is the obvious one. There was a beginning. And science has confirmed that since those early days. And it raises the question of a cause. And therefore, as a pretty obvious inference to a best explanation, you have God as cause being a very highly plausible explanation of the existence of the universe compared with the kind of explanation I've had in more recent years to face coming from the likes of Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss.
And yet many people are ignorant of the Judeo-Christian origins of modern science, the ways that many of those great